There was a wide-mouthed frog who lived down on the lily pad in the pond. And one day she was sitting there with her big long tongue grabbing mosquitoes and flies. And then she got to thinking about eating and what other animals eat and what other mamas feed their babies, because she had a whole pond full of tadpoles. And so she decided that she was going to hop off her lily pad, swim to shore, and hop down the road and look for other mamas and find out what they feed their babies. And as she hopped down the road, she sang a song. Wide-mouthed frog, wide-mouthed frog, isn't it grand to be a wide-mouthed frog? Well, she didn't hop too far until she came up to Mrs. Cow. And Mrs. Cow was standing in the field chewing her cud. And she looked way up at Mrs. Cow and she said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Cow, what do you feed your babies?" And Mrs. Cow said, "I feed my babies green clover and fresh milk." "Oh, that's very interesting." And she started hopping down the road again. And as she hopped, what did she sing? Wide-mouthed frog, wide-mouthed frog, isn't it grand to be a wide-mouthed frog? Well, she didn't hop too far until she came up to Mrs. Horse. And she looked way up at Mrs. Horse and she said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Horse, what do you feed your babies?" And Mrs. Horse looked way down that long face of hers and she said, "Nay, I feed my babies fresh grass and milk." The wide-mouthed frog looked way up and she said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And she started hopping down the road again.
Oh no.
And what did
Wide-mouthed frog, isn't it great to be a wide-mouthed frog?
So you don't even need me. She didn't hop too far until she came to Mrs. Goat. And Mrs. Goat was eating cans and paper and stuff that people had scattered about. And she looked up at Mrs. Goat and she said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Goat, what do you feed your babies?" And Mrs. Goat said, I feed my babies anything we can find." And she looked up and said, "Oh, that's very interesting." And then she started hopping down the road. And as she hopped down the road, she sang, "Wide-mouthed frog, wide-mouthed frog, isn't it great to be a wide-mouthed frog?" Well, she didn't hop too far until she came up to Mrs. Snake.
Freaky.
She said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Snake, what do you feed your babies?" Mrs. Snake said, "I feed my babies wide-mouthed frogs." And the wide-mouthed frog was about to say what she usually said, and then she thought about it. She made her mouth very tiny. She said, "Oh, that's very interesting." She turned around and hopped back to the pond and never left it again.
We won't be eating like